This is Protiviti Legal Perspectives with your host, Chad Volkert, Managing Director and Global Leader of Legal Consulting for Protiviti.
Welcome to Protiviti's Legal Perspectives podcast series, and I'm your host, Chad Volkert, Global Solution Leader here at Protiviti. I'm excited to have you join us today. We have two exceptional experts, Managing Directors Bryan Throckmorton and Joel Wuesthoff, joining the show. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Chad.
Yeah, thanks, Chad. Happy to be here.
So, Bryan, maybe I'll start with you. First and foremost, what is driving the need for AI centers of excellence?
Yeah, for sure, Chad. I think there's a couple of macro trends that I'll unpack for you. But before I get into the first one, let me take you back a little bit. I think I mentioned earlier, I've been in the AI space for about 10 years, which is quite a while to be there. And back in the early days, you were just trying to help clients manage the hype cycle, if you will, because like at that time, if we remember, Watson had come out. It was winning Jeopardy. It was beating Gary Kasparov in chess. And so everyone kind of had these bold expectations of, hey, I can just put my data into AI. It'll tell me the answer, right? But you spend a lot of time trying to work and say, hey, there's actually a handful of things that AI is really good at. So when you're thinking about how to apply it to your business, you have to be kind of thoughtful in how you do that. And at that time, there was only a handful of people in an organization who really knew how to use the AI technology and tools in the first place. And so I say that fast forward. In those days, we were doing a lot of things like helping clients build a portfolio of use cases that they could then try, okay, this AI is good at this. It can fit into the supply chain here, or it can fit into sales and marketing here. Nowadays, every client has a bunch of use cases. Most every client has turned those use cases into prototypes. But if you start going beyond that and start talking and say, do you have a consistent and repeatable way to take an AI-oriented idea and turn that into production, which is where all the value is? There's not that many people doing that. Mm-hmm. A well-structured COE can help facilitate that change, can help you take an idea, take it to prototype, to pilot, and then production as a very streamlined and organized process. So the COE kind of fits in there. The second one, is probably most interesting to your listeners here from a legal perspective. But in those days, and up until fairly recently, you had to have some pretty specialized skills to leverage AI in your organization. Now, thanks to Copilot, ChatGPT, and all the rest, there's probably a 99.99% chance that everyone in your organization is touching AI. Mm-hmm. So what that means is it doesn't matter. 100% of the organizations I talk to now, it doesn't matter the industry, it doesn't matter what part of the business, everyone is trying to figure out, how do I balance the opportunity that AI presents with the risk that it presents? And how do we grapple that? The COE can help bring those stakeholders together. And that's what we're seeing in the marketplace. I think, Joel, it's fair to say, like 3 years ago, it would have been rare to have us in the same room.
Absolutely.
Now, when we go to grab a drink, Joel's ordering my drink for me. I mean, he knows what I want. We're spending a lot more time together because that's the challenge, is balancing that opportunity and risk. And the COE can be a wonderful mechanism to help do that for an organization versus the alternative, which is things just running kind of freestyle out in the wild.
Touching a little bit more maybe on this risk issue and thinking about your, legal background, Joel, maybe share a little bit more context around how companies are approaching the risk associated with AI and the tools being used.
Right. And I'm going to pick up on Bryan's great introduction. I think, we're getting all these stakeholders in a room, and sometimes it's easier than not, but there is a natural tension between the business and strategy side versus the risk management side when deploying new technologies or emerging technologies. And that's not a bad thing. We want that to occur. I think the forward-looking companies that we work with collectively are looking at how to integrate some of the thinking around some of these opportunities of risk management issues that Bryan talked about and to stay true to their mission. And one mission may be risk management and risk mitigation. The other one may be how do we optimize these opportunities? And how do we do that, in a common way? So you've got executive sponsorship, you've got alignment at the senior levels, and you really need to start identifying the roles and responsibilities so that the growth and adoption of AI is conducted jointly with the firm's risk appetite. You can do that through decision trees, through escalation paths, through RACEs. Those are common tools that we're seeing. But at the end of the day, their AI has been around for a long time, but generative AI is fairly new, at least to the corporate suite and to the government in many cases. So that's kind of the first issue. The second issue, I think we're seeing some challenges from a legal perspective, is there's always been an obligation to disclose, and certainly from a privacy perspective, this idea of a black box, and to explain to people how technology impacts them, how things make decisions. If from the early days, algorithms in the financial services industry were fairly straightforward, inputs and outputs, and not a lot of variety. When we're dealing with large language models, we've got this ongoing challenge to understand, first of all, what it means and interpret the data, and then to explain it to a consumer, particularly where there may be a rights or harm impact associated with that use of algorithm. Think about credit scoring or employment decision making. Those things are very important to people, and we have a legal and ethical obligation to communicate what that means. So those are the things that legal teams need to take a look at, from not just the output, but all the way up the stream associated with the development, testing, and deployment of AI. Maybe two other things that I'll just mention is that from a practical perspective, we're seeing our clients thinking about setting up some kind of structured risk assessment. And that may be an intake form. It may be conducting algorithmic impact assessments, looking at high stakes AI systems, and developing a protocol for evaluating whether something is particularly dangerous, but by the same token, making sure that we're green lighting more benign use cases so that we don't slow down the operations of a company. And then finally, I think from a legal perspective and compliance perspective, we need to anticipate, challenges to that due diligence and anticipate regulatory inquiries and third-party inquiries. So from a risk side, we really can't forget that there's a real risk, and there has been over the last 12 months of lawsuits being filed, and companies required to produce all the documentation that they use to evaluate and deploy the AI.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit and maybe, toss it back to you, Bryan, on how can organizations strategically develop these AI centers of excellence that align with their ultimate business goals and capitalize on the opportunities presented in the marketplace? I mean, most notably right now.
Yeah, for sure, Chad. And I'll start out with just things that'll impact, pretty much everyone. And then, potential changes here that might, a loosening of regulation might make, a little bit more aggressive on the opportunity side, and maybe, have to be more thoughtful on the risk side. But I think, and some of the types of risks that Joel's outlined, a lot of that will hold, but I'll come back to that. I think the first thing in ensuring you've got a COE that's going to deliver max value to the business is you have to kind of just acknowledge on the front end that there's different types of COEs. And a lot of times companies will look, well, what do you mean, Bryan? It's like, well, there's COEs that focus more on enablement. And by enablement, I mean like rolling out policies, providing tools, providing different frameworks to utilize. Then there's other COEs that say, hey, we want to do that, and we want to build prototypes. And we'll own the prototype building process, and then another part of the organization will have a way to translate that into production, and that's okay too. Still, other COEs will say, hey, we want to do some flavor of that, but we're going to start out our COE just focused on a particular area of the business, like supply chain or sales and marketing. And so a lot of times, one of the first things we do is like say, hey, let us help you develop a one-page AI charter. And that charter answers questions like, why are we here? Why does our COE exist? How are we going to add value to the organization? How is the rest of the organization going to engage with us? How are we going to be measured? And probably most importantly, who are our stakeholders going to be, and where are we going to focus?
Right.
And it's a deceptively simple thing to say, but getting that on a page is a good challenge. Let's put it that way. But once we have that, Then we have a process to develop an AI, what we call target operating model, or you may hear me refer to it as TOM. But once you know the direction you're going with that charter, then you can start to get to those target operating model questions like, okay, what capabilities do we want to have in our COE? How do we want to have governance over our performance? What roles do we need, both inside the COE, and what roles do we need to have participating from the rest of the organization, like legal and cybersecurity? I mean, what role do those guys play? And from there, you kind of start building this flywheel effect, because if you can answer all those questions around how are we going to collect ideas for projects, how are we going to make prioritization decisions, how are we going to execute and measure ourselves, then you can start saying, okay, the more we do this and run this process, we're consistent, we're repeatable, it's going to help you generate better results. Now, a couple of things that we've learned from doing this a lot that I'll just call out. First, when it comes to engaging with the business, you've really got to democratize the process. And by that, I mean, everyone understands how to submit ideas into the COE. You got to create these ways for them to engage. Sometimes the COE does workshops and say, hey, let's reimagine your part of the business. And that cadence usually quarterly or something like that. So that gets the business engaged in getting ideas. Everyone should understand how to submit a use case. So you start to see this level of clarity. And I was watching the other day is like, I think Elon Musk going back to the legal side, like everybody submit ideas about how we could save money. So it's kind of similar, but like that making it open so everyone understands, hey, this is how I submit an idea. This is how ideas are being prioritized. So if my idea doesn't make it, I at least understand why. Here's how my success is going to be measured. And in terms of value that my ideas, has the potential to bring. And here's how I'm bringing both sides together. And I kind of alluded to that earlier. So in this particular example, like the risk management part happens up front. It's not just value and complexity anymore in terms of assessing projects. We're bringing in the risk up front so you don't get all the way down the line and say, oh, we'll bring in the risk guys, we just can't do it.
Right.
I mean, we're having those conversations early on, and risk is a part of that process of assessing value and prioritization. And it streamlines everything because it's super transparent. Everybody knows what they're doing. And that's how you keep the business engaged.
Yeah. It's interesting, Bryan. I mean, and to dive a little deeper into the risk itself, as you think about what may happen under the new administration with maybe modifying of existing executive orders in and around AI, Joel, is there anything from a legal perspective that organizations should be thinking about navigating during this dynamic regulatory landscape to manage those legal issues effectively?
Yeah, I mean it's fascinating. Bryan talked about democratization. That's what we're seeing. So we've seen policies developed by one administration. We'll see policies developed and or revoked or changed in another one. So what you're talking about, of course, is Donald Trump, President-elect Donald Trump, stated that he will rescind the Biden executive order on AI, which is in 2023. But just to remember that Donald Trump, when he was president before, also issued an executive order on AI, around trustworthy AI in specific, and a lot of the issues that Bryan was talking about. So we don't know what's going to happen, but I will say, but we've had a number of questions from our clients over the last week or so asking what we think is going to happen. So I'll take a stab at that. A lot has been done in the last 18 months around the executive agency in terms of risk management, including appointing chief AI officers for the agencies. And, that's a good practice no matter which administration is in place, making sure that you've got somebody leading the direction, owning that responsibility, whether you call it chief AI officer or chief data officer. But that role has to be owned by somebody together with various domains. So even if the EO, the executive order, and some of these AI procurement memos are revoked or watered down, we've got similar provisions already existing in Colorado, the Colorado AI law or act. We've got the EU AI Act and various other jurisdictions. So I think it's fair to say that there's a kaleidoscope of different emerging state, federal, and international regulations that will likely impact most companies seeking to leverage the promise of AI. So And I will mention, regardless of whether it's overturned or not, there's a recent AI memorandum 2418 that talked a lot about government contracting, but I think it's extensible to the private sector, and particularly around the types of issues that parties leveraging AI, deploying AI, or using AI need to be considering in their third-party contracting relationships. So I think that gives you a good kind of roadmap to some of those legal considerations.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of moving forward on the risk management side, I think there's some practical strategies to your point, Chad. Continue your normal red teaming. We're seeing a lot of clients looking at AI red teaming, much like you do for the security issues that Bryan talked about, and test your environment for some of the specific AI risk issues. Both NIST and OWASP have developed and published a range of unique AI risks to be evaluated. So that's something I think that will survive any administration coming in place.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, think about compliance containers, and that may take the form of a modular AI system that is configurable for different regulatory environments. And the fact is that many clients, and most of our clients certainly operate in multiple jurisdictions. So you're going to have to be aware, like you would any other time, of different compliance priorities, whether it's United States, Europe, or APAC. Third, kind of a knowledge firewall. Think about that to make sure that we don't have AI making unauthorized inferences across data boundaries, and particularly that making sure that we're using AI for a primary purpose. We understand the risks of that, and being very careful about secondary, tertiary purposes that may not be anticipated or approved by a risk committee. And then finally, and I kind of alluded to this before, thinking about the decision paths and recording those decision paths with defendable, human understandable rationales. So in other words, and maybe using the FTC as an example, they've used their enforcement power, I think, on at least 5 times to impose algorithmic disgorgement on multiple companies. So in other words, forcing companies to delete their algorithms that they use to make decisions on behalf of their consumers. So that offers a roadmap from a litigation perspective of the kind of documentation that we would expect a company to have in place if a regulator comes knocking or if plaintiff's counsel comes knocking.
So let me just ask a question, because I know, many of our listeners and audience, larger companies, but we also have a wide variety of mid-sized and smaller organizations looking to innovate who may not necessarily have the budget or think that they have the budget for a center of excellence in and around AI. What would you say to those organizations, Bryan?
Yeah, I think that probably the most important thing to consider is it really doesn't take much to get started. So there's a couple of things to think about. So there's the initial stand up of the COE, which is usually something that can be done in a fairly short amount of time, like 8 to 10 weeks. We obviously do a lot of work helping clients stand that up to make sure they have all the best practices and templates that we talked about throughout the podcast. So that's part of it. And then the staffing side, we've seen folks start a COE with as little as 3 people. And just to get going, a lot of times that could be folks that already sit in a different part of the organization that move over, but now they're equipped with all those best practice templates and processes that we talked about. So really, even for smaller and mid-sized companies, because those are some that we work with, it's a lot easier to get going and start getting results than what you think it will be.
So just to pick up, because you referenced the EU and outside of the 4 walls of the US, which we've been primarily spending our time on today, maybe just share very briefly some thoughts in and around the differing international standards and regulations, Joel, as it pertains to NIST and some of the other issues outside of the U.S.
Right. So we see a lot of our clients, U.S. or international, looking at ISO, looking at NIST. I think most of our clients realize that those are frameworks, guidelines. They're permissive, they're voluntary, they're not required. The EU AI Act, on the other hand, is a substantial cross-industry regulation that is going to be going in over about 2 years and was passed, adopted, and published in early August of this year. That particular law is risk-based, and so it helpfully defines the type of risk that is unacceptable. Think scoring, and a lot of publicity in China around scoring individuals, your friends, your finances, those kind of things that may put potentially has the impact of reducing an individual's ability to get a loan or get education or travel. So those things would be unacceptable. The bulk of the EU AI Act that again will impact any company most likely doing business in the U.S. Revolves around what the federal government has called rights or harm-inducing use cases, and Bryan talked a lot about use cases. So any company that's doing business there or working in the EU will need to think about the types of use case as they start to onboard those use cases, and whether or not it's some type of educational, health, rights, voting rights, any of those type of things that we take for granted as a fundamental right. If there's a chance that some of those, the use of AI might enable discrimination or potentially reduce the benefits that we now occupy as members of a free society. So those kind of things, I think the EU AI Act has very much approached from a prescriptive perspective. So we'll have to see how those tensions evolve as you deal from an international perspective with our international clients. And again, more regulations will be issued by the AI board and the EU Commission. But I think from the perspective of those use cases, contractual perspectives amongst third parties where you might be onboarding a large language model, and then dealing with some of the IP issues associated with the scraping of the internet for the training of these large language models. So lots of things to think about and many headaches to come.
Well, I mean, to your point, the amount of moving pieces, Joel, right, as you start moving globally, let alone just in North America. And maybe, Bryan, in context of this global competition and this boom that's happening across the globe and what data can do for an organization, how can AI centers of excellence position their organization to literally stay ahead of the curve, ahead of AI innovation, while maintaining agility and really a nimble strategy and execution?
Yeah, that's the challenge, isn't it, Chad? It'd be great if we were just like in a static world and it stayed the same for a while, but we are not there. We're in a dynamic environment, so you really have to think about that. Just a handful of things to keep in mind. A great COE both enables and evangelizes the potential and the guardrails, right? So it's constantly being proactive about engaging with the business. And that kind of leads to what we call an always on idea generation process. Now, this may sound counterintuitive because we have some clients, it's like, look, Bryan, we got 500 plus use cases. We don't need any more use cases. And I tell them the same thing that I opened this question with. That's great if we were static, but we're not. It's dynamic. What's important today or leading technology now could change in 3 months or less. And so you need to have this always on idea generation function to where you're constantly engaging with the business to generate more ideas. Second is you need to probably take the number of prototypes or ideas that are turning into prototypes and double or triple it with what you're doing today. But you need to shrink that cycle time instead of taking like a few months to do a prototype, weeks, 4 or 5 weeks. Prove the point. Scope it for time versus functionality. You'll start learning at an accelerated pace. And just as importantly, you'll get comfortable being uncomfortable because a well-structured COE, not everything's going to work. Some things are going to work, some things are going to not. So fail fast, put those ideas to the side, put your efforts on taking those into production, the ones that make the most difference. And then finally, I kind of alluded to it way back when we started talking about why have a COE, think through that idea to prototype to production process. Typical barriers that get in the way is, we've done a successful prototype. Great. Well, now we got to find budget and resourcing. Assume success.
Right.
Think about what has to happen to streamline that process. So how would we change decision rights? How would we think about resourcing or budgeting so that we don't have all this start and stop that gets in the way of collecting the value? And so those are just some of the things that can really help you take a COE and turn it into a competitive advantage for you, especially in this uber global competitive environment we're in.
But if there was 1 or 2 key points from each of you, what would those be? And maybe I'll start with you, Joel.
Building out your responsible AI policies, your charter, what's important as an organization? Put it on paper, make it real, make it true. Have it be a deliberative, multiple stakeholder exercise so that you've got a roadmap that reflects the values of the organization, the industry that you're in, what's important to your employees, your executives, your consumers, and have that be a document that leads you forward. Secondly, I would suggest, and Bryan alluded to this algorithmic tracking system, some system for keeping in a central place what it is the company is considering. And you can use that for innovation, for kind of brainstorming, and you can also use it for risk management.
I'll go next. I'll try to keep it to two. I think probably the most important one, and this is gonna, maybe sound a little strange, but I always just say start with value. And the reason why I say that is in the space we're in now with AI, things are going so fast. It's so tempting to chase the shiny object, or this is a use case that sounds really cool. But if you don't understand how that's going to pull the value lever for the business, then don't do it, or reevaluate, maybe try something else, or think hard about how it could. So I always say start with value the first, because that's going to maintain your engagement with the rest of the organization. And then I think Joel was kind of alluding to it, but setting up some operating rhythms so that you have governance committees and steering companies that give you that auto magic way to engage with the business, because you know that every quarter we're going to come together and talk about our progress. What are we doing? What's worked? What didn't work? And there's different cadences between quarterly, monthly, in some cases weekly, but those then operational rhythms lead you to a communication plan. Because too many times there's incredible things happening. The rest of the organization has no clue. And so how do you think that you build that next backlog of ideas? Well, you get people's juices flowing with, hey, here's what we're already doing. How could this apply to my business? So I think those two things, just starting with the value and kind of building those rhythms to where it becomes part of the fabric of your organization, to think about how could AI impact every business process and every business decision that I make at this business.
It's been a great show today. Unfortunately, we're out of time. For the listeners out there, thanks again for watching today. And until next time, make it the best day yet.
Thank you for listening today. To learn more about Protiviti, visit us at protiviti.com.